Hello and welcome back. Robin Vane has written a new story for us today. It is called The Tuesday Players. Settle in, find your quiet, and let us begin. Act 1. The Notice. The notice was handwritten on an index card and pinned to the board in the hardware store between a listing for a used lawnmower and an advertisement for a dog walking service. Community Orchestra. All instruments welcome, all levels. Tuesday evenings, 7 o'clock. The Old Town Hall. Come as you are. Casey read it twice, standing in the hardware store with a box of screws in one hand and the kind of distracted attention that comes from being in a place to buy one thing and happening to notice something else. The screws were for the front porch railing, which had been needing attention for 2 months. The index card was not something Casey had been looking for. Casey unpinned the card and took it to the register and paid for the screws, and drove home and set the card on the kitchen counter. It stayed there for a week. The violin was in the closet in the spare room. Casey had not opened that closet in a long time, perhaps 2 years, perhaps more. It was the kind of closet that collected things that no longer had obvious places and things that had been put away temporarily and were still there. The violin was in its case, which was a hard-sided brown case that had been a good case once and was now simply old. Casey had put it there when the last move happened 12 years ago, when this town had become home, and had not taken it out since. Before that, it had been in a different closet in a different city, also not played, also occasionally thought about, the way you think about something you have put down and are not yet ready to pick up, and are perhaps never going to be ready to pick up, but cannot bring yourself to give away. Casey had played the violin from the age of 8 to the age of 20. 12 years of lessons and practice, and 2 school orchestras, and 1 youth symphony, and the particular relationship with an instrument that forms when you spend enough of your childhood with it, the relationship of the body rather than only the mind, the instrument becoming an extension of something physical, a way of making sound that is also a way of being in a room. At 20, in the middle of everything else that was happening at 20, Casey had stopped. Not dramatically. There had been no moment of decision, no putting the bow down for the last time with any awareness that it was the last time. It had simply happened the way many things happen at 20, in the rush of new things arriving, the instrument falling to one side while everything else pressed forward. And then a month had passed, and then 6 months, and then a year, and by the time the absence registered, it had been long enough that returning felt like more effort than it was worth. That had been many years ago now. Casey was 61. The violin had been in various closets for 41 years. Casey looked at the index card on the counter for 7 days, and on the seventh day took the violin case out of the closet. The clasps were stiff. Casey worked them open carefully, not forcing anything, the instinct for care coming back before anything else did. Inside, the violin lay in its velvet cradle the way it always had, and the bow was in its holder, and everything was present and intact, and, Casey noted with something that was not quite surprise, rather dusty. Casey lifted the violin out. It was lighter than remembered, or memory had made it heavier, which was the same thing. The wood was the same deep amber it had always been, the grain visible under the finish, the scroll at the top still elegant in the particular way of things made with genuine craft, things whose beauty is structural rather than decorative. Casey plucked one string. The sound that came out was not musical. The string had lost whatever tension it had once held, and the note was flat and dull and immediate, the sound of something that had been waiting too long. Casey set the violin back in the case and looked at it for a while. Then Casey picked up the phone and called the number on the index card. A person answered who sounded older and distracted in a warm way, the distraction of someone in the middle of something enjoyable rather than something pressing. The person said the ensemble was not an orchestra exactly, more of a gathering, people who played various instruments at various levels, who met on Tuesday evenings and worked through pieces together without much concern for perfection. Casey asked what level was expected. The person said, "We have people who played seriously when they were young, and people who never played seriously at all, and people somewhere in between. We have a Tuesday player's motto, show up and try." Casey said, "I have not played in 41 years." The person on the phone said, "We have had worse. Come on Tuesday." Casey went to the music shop the following day and had the violin restrung and the bow rehaired, and the whole instrument looked at by a young person behind the counter, who handled it with the careful attention of someone who had been taught to respect instruments, regardless of their age or condition. The young person said it was in good shape, considering. Casey did not ask considering what, it seemed clear enough. Driving home, Casey thought about Tuesday. The feeling was not quite anticipation and not quite dread. It was something more provisional than either of those, the feeling of having agreed to something before knowing fully what it was, which Casey recognized as a feeling that had preceded most of the better things in life as well as a number of the worse ones, and was therefore not a reliable indicator of anything except that something was about to happen. Something was about to happen. Casey drove home through the town that had been home for 12 years, and thought about the violin on the seat behind, and about being 8 years old and first holding it, and about the particular sound of a properly tuned open string, the kind of sound that seems to fill more space than it should, and about Tuesday. Act Two: The Playing. The old town hall was a building Casey had passed many times without going inside. Inside it was larger than it looked from the street, with a high ceiling that would be good for sound and wooden floors that had been good once and were now well worn, and a row of mismatched chairs arranged in a rough semicircle near the far end, under the best of the overhead lights. There were already 6 people there when Casey arrived, with instruments in various stages of readiness, and more came in over the following 10 minutes until there were 11 in total. The person who answered the phone was named Harriet, who was somewhere in the 70s and played the cello with the quality of someone who had played it all their life and no longer thought about playing it but simply played. Harriet ran the group in the way of someone who does not think of themselves as running anything but around whom organization naturally accretes. Harriet said, "Welcome," when Casey came in and pointed at an empty chair, and that was the extent of the welcome, which Casey found just right. The group was what it had been described as: 2 violins besides Casey's, 1 viola, Harriet's cello, a flute, a clarinet, a trumpet that had been there the longest according to Harriet, and whose player, a quiet person named Graham, had clearly also played the longest and served as a kind of anchor for the group's pitch, without making anything of this role. There was a piano in the corner played by someone who had come late and whose name Casey did not catch, and a recorder, which was being played by the youngest person in the room, who looked to be in the early 30s and who played it with a seriousness that Casey found both endearing and slightly startling. They started with something simple. Harriet had chosen a piece that Casey did not know, something from an earlier century, slow enough and clear enough in its structure that the various levels in the room could find their way through it without too much difficulty. Casey opened the sheet music and looked at the notes. Reading music was like reading a language not used in many years. The knowledge was there, structural, embedded in a part of the mind that did not forget things entirely, only let them go quiet. Casey found the notes on the page and found the corresponding positions on the violin, and the bow went to the string, and what came out was not good. It was not good in a way that was immediately and entirely clear to Casey, and presumably to everyone else in the room. It was the sound of a person who once knew something and had let it go quiet for 4 decades, the knowledge still present, but the execution rusty in ways that would take time to address. The intonation was uncertain. The bow arm had forgotten its own history. The fingers found the positions, but not quickly enough, not smoothly enough, with a hesitation between the knowing and the doing that produced a result that was objectively not musical. Casey kept playing. This was the important thing. Casey had expected it to be bad, and it was bad, and Casey kept playing anyway, which felt like something, though exactly what was not yet clear. Harriet glanced across once, not critically, and then looked back at her music. Graham, the trumpet player, made no indication that he had heard anything unusual. The recorder player, who was also not playing entirely in tune, looked at Casey once with an expression of complete fellow feeling. Casey looked back, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile but served the same function. They played through the piece twice. The second time was marginally better than the first, not because Casey had improved in any measurable way, but because the room had gotten louder, everyone finding a little more confidence in the second pass, and Casey's uncertain contributions were more absorbed by the whole, the way an individual voice is absorbed into a chorus, present and real, but no longer isolated. After the piece, Harriet said, "Good, let's try the next one." The next one was harder. Casey made more mistakes in the next one and found, to some surprise, that the mistakes bothered less than expected. There was something about making mistakes in a room full of other people also making mistakes that was different from making mistakes alone. The mistakes were more visible and also less significant. They were part of the sound the room was making, the total imperfect sound of 11 people playing something together with varying degrees of skill and the common intention of getting through it. They played for 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, Casey's left hand ached in a specific way that was entirely familiar, the ache of the fingertips pressed against strings for an extended period, the ache Casey had not felt in 41 years, but recognized immediately and completely, the way you recognize a particular kind of weather before you can name it. Casey sat for a moment after the others had started packing up, holding the violin and looking at nothing in particular. Harriet came and sat in the adjacent chair and said, "Not bad." Casey said, "That is extremely generous." Harriet said, "I mean it. For someone who has not played in that long, the knowledge is still in there. It just needs practice to come back out." Casey said, "How long will that take?" Harriet considered this honestly and said, "Months, probably. Maybe longer, but it comes, if you keep showing up." Casey looked at the violin in hand. Said, I had forgotten what this felt like. Harriet said, which part? Casey thought about it, said, the part where you are in a room making sound with other people, and the sound is the whole point. There is nothing the sound is for except itself. That is unusual. Most things are for something else. Harriet looked at Casey for a moment and then said, yes, that is exactly it. That is why we are all here. Casey drove home through the Tuesday evening with the violin on the seat behind and the fingertip ache in the left hand, and something else that was harder to name, something that had been opened, that had been closed for a long time, not broken open, not forced, just opened, the way a window is opened on the first warm day, carefully, and with the immediate sense that the air that comes in was needed. Act 3, the sound. By the sixth Tuesday, something had shifted. Casey could not have said exactly when it happened or what specifically had changed, because it had not happened at once, but gradually. The way the light changes in a room as the season turns, so slowly that you do not notice the change itself, but only look up one day and find that things are different from how they were. The intonation was better, not good, not yet, but better in ways that were audible, the notes landing closer to where they were supposed to land, the ear and the hand beginning to work together again with something approaching the old fluency. The bow arm had found some of its history. The fingers still hesitated, but less, the pathway between knowing and doing clearing as the weeks passed. More than the playing itself, something else had changed. Casey had started practicing at home. This had not been a decision exactly. It had happened the way things happen when something has been genuinely opened. The opening created a pull, the pull created a habit, the habit created more opening. Casey had taken the violin out on the Wednesday evening after the first Tuesday and played for 20 minutes badly, and then on Thursday evening for 30 minutes somewhat less badly, and this had continued until the practicing was simply part of the week, a thing that happened on certain evenings in the living room while the light outside did what it did. The neighbors had not complained. Casey had worried about this and then had stopped worrying because the neighbors had not complained, and also because there was something in the act of playing, even badly, that made the worrying about it feel less important than the playing itself. On the sixth Tuesday, halfway through the second piece, something happened that Casey had been waiting for without knowing how to wait for it. The piece was something Harriet had chosen that was gentle and slow, and built on a repeating figure that wound through the various instruments in sequence before coming back to the beginning and going around again. Casey had been playing the figure when it happened, had been playing the repeating pattern and listening to it move from the cello to the flute to the clarinet and back, and something in the listening and the playing at the same time had produced a moment where the gap between knowing and doing closed. Just for a moment, perhaps 4 bars, perhaps less. But in those bars, Casey was not thinking about where to put the fingers or how to hold the bow or whether the note that had just sounded was in tune. In those bars, Casey was simply playing the way it had once been possible to simply play, the body and the instrument and the music briefly continuous, briefly one thing, the way they had been once and had not been for 41 years. It passed. The next note was uncertain again, and the gap returned. But it had happened, and Casey knew it had happened and knew also that it would happen again, would happen more often, would eventually stop being exceptional and become ordinary if the practicing continued and the Tuesdays continued, and the opening continued to open. After that evening, walking to the car through the autumn dark with the violin case, Casey thought about the 8-year-old who had first held this instrument. What had that felt like? There was no precise memory, only the general impression of something large and new and full of possibility, the quality of beginning that belongs to childhood, before you understand that beginning also means not yet knowing, that the not knowing is the beginning and not a problem to be solved. Casey had spent a lot of years knowing things, knowing how to do the work, knowing how to be in a town, knowing how to be a person of a certain age with a certain life. The knowing was good. The knowing was necessary. But there was something in the not knowing of this, the genuine beginnerness of relearning something the body had once known, that had a quality the knowing did not. It required all of Casey. Every Tuesday evening and every evening of practice, it required all of Casey, the full attention without which the fingers went wrong and the bow bounced and the music fell apart. And in requiring all of Casey, it gave something back that was difficult to name, a fullness of presence that ordinary competence did not produce, the specific quality of being entirely where you were because being partly somewhere else meant the music stopped. Casey had not known how much had been missed. Not the violin specifically, though the violin too, but the thing the violin was a version of, the thing that any practice requiring full attention and producing something that mattered only in itself was a version of. The hours in childhood spent this way, practicing and playing and making sound with other people, and then the decades of not doing it, and now this, the return, imperfect and ongoing and entirely worth it. The Tuesday Players had a concert in December. Harriet had mentioned it at the third meeting as a matter of fact, rather than a warning, saying only that they played once a year at the community center for anyone who wanted to come, and that the audience was invariably kind, because the audience was invariably made up of people who knew the players personally and wanted them to do well. Casey had said nothing about the concert for 3 meetings, and on the sixth Tuesday, after the moment of 4 bars where everything had briefly worked, had said to Harriet on the way out, "I will play in the concert." Harriet had looked at Casey with something that might have been satisfaction and said, "I thought you would." Casey drove home through the autumn dark and thought about December. There was time, not a great deal of time, but enough. Enough to practice, enough to improve, enough to stand in the community center in December and play alongside 11 other people of varying levels for an audience that wanted them to do well, and to make the imperfect sound that 11 people playing together make, and to be entirely present in the making of it. 41 years was a long time to put something down. Casey thought about the index card on the kitchen counter, the 7 days of looking at it, the stiff clasps on the violin case, the first terrible Tuesday, and the ache in the left hand driving home. The 6 weeks of practicing in the living room while the light outside changed. The fourth bar of the repeating figure on the sixth Tuesday, when the gap had closed for a moment and the sound had simply been the sound. It was worth it, all of it, the difficulty and the patience and the months of being worse than one had once been, working back toward something that would eventually be different from what it had been, shaped by the person Casey had become across the 41 years rather than the person Casey had been at 20. Not a return, exactly, a continuation. The thread picked up again after a long interruption and followed forward rather than back. Casey parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going in. The night was clear and cold and completely quiet except for the sound of something in the trees at the edge of the yard, wind or a bird or nothing, a sound at the edge of hearing. Casey listened to it for a moment and then took the violin case from the seat and went inside. Tomorrow there was practicing to do. Casey was looking forward to it. End of novel.